For those of you who don't know me, my name is Ethan. I am a sophomore at Wake Forest University, hailing from the great state of Colorado, undoubtedly the best in the union. I have a variety of experiences which have qualified me for the outreach coordinator position. All of them revolve around some form of advocacy, be them political or human rights centric. Currently, I'm working with a group called the Free Yemen Initiative, otherwise known as FYI. In that capacity, I serve as the president, more or less, of the organization. We are a 501c3 organization, and we work to deliver humanitarian aid to Yemeni refugees. In that role, I've learned a lot about the importance of cross-cultural collaboration, but also internal organization. And from those experiences, I've learned a lot about what it means to be a successful grassroots organization. I'm also involved in a number of other experiences. Obviously, my statement was not exhaustive. It was more pretty, and it wasn't very detailed, so I apologize about that. But I do work a lot with political advocacy groups. Currently, I work with the college Democrats at Wake Forest. In that capacity, I serve as the director of communications. I envision the work that I do with that group to be very similar to the work that I would do with this group, namely communicating within the organization, but also to interested parties and speakers to coordinate and to hopefully, get different events planned for the organization and also the university. I'm also involved in a number of other political advocacy groups and projects. I'm currently a campaign fellow for the Terry LeGrand campaign for North Carolina. I do a lot of communication as well in that capacity, but also research into policy issues which affect the entire state, as well as Terry's constituents. So I learned a lot about that as well, and the importance of incorporating values into your mission and your work. So these are some of the marquee experiences which have taught me a lot about the importance of organization, communication, and collaboration. I have other more disparate experiences, but I would say that those are my primary experiences. So first, I would say as a premise that I think the NCSL needs to structure itself before it can actually start its advocacy. And so to do that, I think there needs to be considerable amount of time devoted to, to examining the structure of the organization, examining the ways in which the roles will operate outside of their, pre-existing framework. So in truth too, having researched a lot of political advocacy groups, specifically those led by students, historically they have fallen apart and ultimately, divided into internal factions because of the fact that they were not organized as a body, and they did not have the structure necessary to sustain their advocacy in the long term. And so my first priority would be the structure of the organization. In regards to your question though, I think the key issues facing students currently, at least in my experience, especially being at a school like Wake Forest, is student tuition is obviously astronomically high. I think there can be efforts to reduce that through collaboration with school administrators, through our various connections and lobbying efforts, be it in Washington or at the doorsteps of the university. I also see efforts to incorporate diversity and inclusion to be very important, especially this year. In my current role in student government as the judiciary co-chair, I'm actually working on various diversity and inclusion initiatives. We're trying to, for example, evaluate how we go about senatorial appointment processes and combating implicit biases. Not to get too far off track there, but that would be my second priority. My third priority, I think, would be sustainability. I think there is a lot to be done in regard to sustainability in college campuses and reducing waste and making sure that students have the opportunity to pursue an education free of fears that their environment, be it on campus or off campus, will not be sustainable. In fact, after our first meeting with the NCSL, this is something that someone brought up, and I can't believe we neglected to include that within our within our governing documents and in our guiding principles, because I think it is very much an important issue which affects us all in some way or another. So those are my top 3 priorities as outreach coordinator. I would say that the first step, as I mentioned, is working with the exec to make sure that we're all on the same page. I think from there, you really have to target certain geographic regions, which I think is something that in the long term might even be something where we have separate positions for the outreach coordinator, that they target specific regions and have certain connections within each region. But to begin with, I think reviewing the candidates' applications, it seems to me like we are a predominantly Western and northern centric group, which isn't necessarily a bad thing when we're starting an organization. Obviously, those regions have, I think, the most connections. So I think we can certainly do a lot, and at least in the initial stages, to really reap the, or to use the connections that we already have within our specific regions and student coalitions and advocacy groups to form the best connections that we can. I would also say, though, that one of the benefits of my candidacy is that I do come from a more southern university, and I don't think reviewing the candidates who are currently running, we have much of a southern representation. And so, as I mentioned, I think there needs to be very coordinated efforts to incorporate every region of the United States and targeting the coalitions and the student government associations that are closest to our members and executive bodies. And so I will also just say as a side note to that, in the outreach coordinator's capacity to oversee the outreach committee, I think there should be sustained efforts to incorporate diversity and inclusion into that committee so that we can target the regions we need to really make those lasting connections with student groups and advocacy groups. In regards to Washington, I will admit that, I would imagine, like most of us, I don't have, a senator's phone number in my back pocket. And although that would be cool and maybe something I could hopefully get one day, I'm not going to pretend like that's something I have at my disposal. But I think that, being a student-centric group, I think that our efforts, and historically looking at precedent as well for student-led groups like this, I think that what will work is that we start our advocacy by reaching out to students. I think our success will be student-focused and it will be student-based. And so with that success, I think that we can gain the attention of policymakers in Washington and establish those long-term connections we need to make our advocacy worthwhile.